Welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to talk about one of the more controversial heroes of the early republic, Thomas Jefferson. What did he think of Native Americans? Thomas Jefferson had complex, often contradictory views about Native Americans. Jefferson admired Native Americans for their simplicity and their connection to nature. He perceived them as having physical prowess and a lifestyle in harmony with the environment. He believed that they possessed natural rights similar to Europeans and should be treated with respect. Jefferson advocated for the assimilation of Native Americans, however. He thought that they should become, gradually, part of Euro-American culture. He believed that there were important facets to this. By adopting agriculture, by becoming Christians, and by taking on European customs, Native Americans could integrate into American society. This approach was part of a broader vision he had of an agrarian society filled with yeoman farmers. Jefferson's policies correspondingly often conflicted with his more idealistic views. He greatly supported the westward expansion of the United States, which inevitably led to the displacement of native tribes. In 1803, he approved the Louisiana Purchase, which significantly expanded U.S. territory, increasing pressure on native lands. Jefferson's administration negotiated numerous treaties with Native American tribes, often involving land cessions. While these treaties were presented as mutually beneficial, they often resulted in native peoples being forced to give up their ancestral lands and relocate. In his correspondence and writings, Jefferson expressed a mix of admiration and paternalism towards Native Americans. He saw them as noble, but ultimately also in need of guidance and civilization. His attitudes reflected the prevailing views of his time, but also included his personal ideals of liberty and human rights. Despite Jefferson's assimilationist policies, many native tribes resisted encroachment and maintained their cultural identities. Jefferson's policies laid the groundwork for the later, more forceful removal policies carried out under subsequent administrations, culminating in events like the Trail of Tears. So let's talk about the Louisiana Purchase in particular. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had profound and far-reaching impacts on Native American peoples. Here are several key ways that it affected them. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory by the U.S. significantly increased pressure on native tribes and lands. The vast expanse of new territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, included lands inhabited, of course, by copious amounts of native tribes. The U.S. government saw this new land as an opportunity for expansion and settlement by American citizens, leading to increased encroachment on native territories. As American settlers moved westward into the newly acquired territory, native tribes were often forced to relocate. That process, which began in earnest after the Louisiana Purchase, resulted in all these treaties that were frequently unfavorable to Native Americans. It involved cession of large tracts of land and the displacement of tribes from their ancestral homelands. The influx of American settlers into the Louisiana Territory led to numerous conflicts with Native American tribes. These conflicts were often violent and resulted in the loss of life, land, and resources for native peoples. Tribes that resisted relocation or the encroachments of settlers faced military action and often destruction by the U.S. government. The U.S. government's policies aimed at assimilating Native Americans into American society, undermining their sovereignty. Native tribes were increasingly treated as wards of the state, rather than as independent nations. This erosion of sovereignty was facilitated by the establishment of reservations and the imposition of U.S. laws and regulations on native peoples. The traditional economies of many native tribes were disrupted by the loss of land and resources. Hunting, fishing, and agricultural practices that had sustained tribes for generations were often no longer viable. This economic disruption led to increased dependency on the U.S. government for food supplies and other necessities. The forced relocation and assimilation policies had significant cultural impacts on native communities. Traditional ways of life, language, and customs were often suppressed as tribes were encouraged or forced to adopt Euro-American practices. This cultural erosion had lasting effects on the identity and heritage of native peoples. Finally, the Louisiana Purchase set the stage for the later establishment of the reservation system. As more native tribes were displaced, the U.S. government began to designate specific areas of land for them to live on, often in less desirable locations. These reservations were intended to confine and control native populations, further restricting their freedom and way of life. So, Thomas Jefferson's legacy concerning native peoples is complex and includes both deeply troubling and more commendable aspects. Here's an assessment of the worst and best aspects of his legacy. So the worst parts of Jefferson's legacy. Jefferson's vision of an expanding agrarian republic contributed significantly to the displacement of native tribes. His support for westward expansion and the acquisition of new territories like the Louisiana Purchase led to an increased pressure on native lands and the subsequent forced relocation of many tribes. Jefferson's belief in the assimilation of Native Americans into Euro-American culture, while seemingly well-intentioned, was also paternalistic and failed to respect their sovereignty. His policies encouraged or forced Native Americans to abandon their traditional ways of life, leading to the erosion of their cultural identities. The treaties negotiated under Jefferson's administration often involved coercion and deceit, resulting in the cession unfairly of native lands. These treaties left native tribes with little choice but to relinquish their ancestral territories and move to less desirable lands, undermining their autonomy and livelihoods. If we will admire something about Jefferson, it's probably his admiration for native cultures. He expressed in his letters and correspondence a genuine admiration for certain aspects of native culture. He thought they were really, really physically gifted. He thought that they understood nature better than white people. He thought that their simple way of life was somehow virtuous. He recognized that they had some intellectual capabilities and believed that if they were capable of achieving the same levels of education and civilization as Europeans, then they'd be able to hit the mark. He also advocated for the education of native peoples, believing that education was a means to their betterment. Although his vision was rooted in assimilationist ideals, he did see education as a way for Native Americans to gain the skills and knowledge necessary to coexist with the Europeans. He supported initiatives to educate native people, native youth in American schools and colleges. So, thank you so much for listening as we thought about this very complicated precedent.